I am Maya, 32 years old, and a financial risk manager by trade. 3 months after burying my husband Marcus, I forced myself to attend my sister Chloe's son's first birthday party. Standing in front of our entire church congregation, she pointed a trembling finger at me and announced that my late husband was her baby's father. She even waved a piece of paper claiming it was his will demanding half of my $600,000 home as her son's inheritance. I just looked at her, held back a laugh, and said, I see. Because my husband took a biological secret to his grave that made her entire performance a ridiculous lie. Before I tell you how I dismantled her life piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who mistook your silence for weakness. The afternoon sun was beating down on the manicured lawn of the country club, where our mother, Mama Yvonne, had insisted we host baby Leo's first birthday. Dozens of members from our church congregation were dressed in their Sunday best, sipping sweet tea and eating expensive catered food. I had been married to Marcus, a dedicated surgeon, for 7 beautiful years, before a horrific accident took him from me. I was still wearing dark colors, still waking up in a cold sweat reaching for a man who was no longer there. But family duty and Mama Yvonne's obsession with public appearances had dragged me out of my quiet sanctuary today. Chloe, my 28-year-old sister, had always been the golden child of the family. She wore a pristine white summer dress, playing the role of the perfect innocent mother while holding little Leo on her hip. Her husband Brad stood beside her. Brad was a 30-year-old white man who constantly bragged about his real estate investments to anyone who would listen, yet he always seemed to need a sudden urgent loan to keep his ventures afloat. For years, I was the one expected to quietly fix their financial messes, so Mama Yvonne could maintain her flawless image at church. The cheerful chatter of the party came to a sudden jarring halt when the clinking of a spoon against a crystal glass rang out across the patio. Chloe stood near a massive 3-tier cake, wiping a perfectly timed tear from her cheek. I expected a traditional speech about the joys of motherhood and the blessings of the past year. Instead, she looked directly at me. Her voice shook with heavily rehearsed sorrow as she spoke into the microphone. She thanked everyone for coming, took a deep, dramatic breath, and declared that she simply could not live with the heavy burden of guilt anymore. She looked at our pastor seated in the front row, then at our mother, and finally locked her tear-filled eyes on me. She announced to the entire crowd that Marcus, my beloved late husband, was actually Leo's real father. The entire lawn went dead silent. You could hear the wind rustling through the trees. Women in their wide-brimmed church hats gasped in horror. Mama Yvonne dropped her silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a loud clatter, her face draining of color as she realized our family image was disintegrating in real time. I stood frozen near the gift table, my heart pounding against my ribs. But years of working in high-pressure corporate environments took over. My mind immediately shifted into the analytical, emotionless mode I used every day as a financial risk manager. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply watched my sister play her calculated role. Chloe reached into her designer bag and pulled out a folded document. She sobbed loudly into the microphone, claiming she and Marcus had shared a moment of weakness during a difficult time in my marriage. A difficult time that never actually existed. She claimed Marcus had been eaten alive by guilt in his final days. She waved the paper in the air, declaring it was a will Marcus had secretly drawn up right before he died. According to Chloe, Marcus wanted to ensure his only biological child was properly taken care of. She read a passage aloud stating the will demanded, I surrender 50% of the equity in my $600,000 home to her and Brad so they could raise the boy with the resources he deserved. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the humid air like poison. That was when Brad stepped forward, wrapping a protective arm around Chloe's shoulders. He looked at me with a smug, condescending smirk that he barely bothered to hide from the church elders watching us. He cleared his throat and addressed the crowd, acting like the reasonable, forgiving peacemaker stepping in to handle a delicate family tragedy. Then he looked right at me. He said they did not want to make this harder on me than it already was. He crossed his arms and told me that since I was a professional financial risk manager, I should easily know how to calculate this split reasonably and efficiently. He advised me to do the math and hand over the equity quietly so we could avoid a messy court battle that would embarrass the family further. He actually had the nerve to tell me to be smart about it, as if he were offering me a favor by stealing half of everything I owned. The entitlement radiating from Brad and Chloe was staggering. They were banking on my grief. They were banking on Mama Yvonne forcing me to comply just to sweep this massive scandal under the rug. They thought I would crumble under the public humiliation, burst into tears, and hand over my assets to avoid the harsh whispers and judgment of the church gossips. They thought my silence was shock, but it was actually calculation. I did not throw a drink in her face. I did not curse at them or defend my husband's honor by screaming. I set my glass of iced water down on the table, smoothed the front of my dark dress, and walked slowly toward them. The crowd parted from me as if I were a ghost. Mama Yvonne was hyperventilating in her chair, whispering frantic prayers under her breath, already terrified of what the congregation would think of her daughters. When I reached Chloe and Brad, I looked at the piece of paper trembling in my sister's hand. I offered a cold, polite smile that completely unnerved them. I said, "I see. That is quite a shocking revelation. If what you are saying is true, and Marcus really left a legally binding document demanding I sell my home, then I suppose we have a lot to discuss." I held out my hand, my palm facing upward. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked if she would be so kind as to let me read this miraculous will. Brad hesitated, his smug grin faltering for a split second. He glanced at Chloe, who suddenly looked terrified. They had wanted a hysterical widow. They wanted me to run away crying so they could control the narrative and paint themselves as the responsible guardians of a fatherless child. My absolute calm was not in their script. Brad puffed out his chest and said I could look at the copy, but his lawyer had the original locked safely in his office. He handed me the folded paper. The paper felt cheap in my hands. I unfolded it right there in front of the pastor, the choir director, and dozens of whispering relatives. I scanned the text rapidly. The legal jargon was clunky and outdated, clearly copied and pasted from a free template on the internet. But what caught my immediate attention was the date and the signature at the very bottom of the page. A cold, sharp clarity washed over my entire body. The trap they had set was so incredibly flimsy it was an insult to my intelligence. But I knew that reacting right then, tearing the paper up, or calling them liars without my own ironclad proof, would only give them the dramatic scene they craved. I needed to let them dig their graves much deeper before I buried them. I folded the paper neatly and slipped it into my purse. I looked directly into Brad's eyes and thanked him for bringing this urgent matter to my attention. I told him I would have my own attorneys review the document immediately to ensure everything was handled exactly by the book. Then I turned to my sister, who was still trying to squeeze out fake tears, and wished her son a very happy birthday. Without waiting for a response, without giving them a single ounce of the emotion they wanted to feed on, I turned my back on them and walked away, leaving the entire congregation in stunned, breathless silence. I had barely made it past the buffet tables when fingers dug into my upper arm like a vice. Mama Yvonne yanked me backward with a force that bruised. She did not care that her acrylic nails were biting through the fabric of my dress. She only cared that Pastor Thomas and Sister Wallace were standing less than 10 feet away, their eyes wide with shock at the scandal that had just erupted on the lawn. My mother flashed them a strained megawatt smile, apologizing loudly for the sudden family drama before shoving me hard through the swinging metal doors of the country club catering kitchen. The heavy doors swung shut abruptly, cutting off the loud whispers of the congregation outside. The kitchen was empty, the catering staff having stepped out to manage the dessert service. Mama Yvonne spun around, her face twisted in a mask of absolute fury. It was a look I had seen 1,000 times before, usually right before I was forced to empty my savings account to fix one of Brad's many financial disasters. I braced myself foolishly, thinking that for once in her life, she might actually apologize for Chloe's horrific public spectacle. I thought she might express outrage that her youngest daughter had just confessed to sleeping with my late husband. Instead, she pointed a shaking finger inches from my face. She demanded to know what was wrong with me. She hissed that I was trying to humiliate this entire family in front of the church board by walking away like a snob. I stared at the woman who had given birth to me, completely stunned by her twisted logic. My husband had just been accused of fathering my sister's child, and her biggest concern was her social standing in the church pews. I asked her if she had gone deaf out there. I asked if she cared that her golden child just proudly announced she had committed adultery with her own brother-in-law. Mama Yvonne did not miss a single beat. She crossed her arms and stepped closer, lowering her voice to that lethal quiet tone she used when she wanted to completely break my spirit. She told me to stop acting like a dramatic victim. She looked me dead in the eyes and said I was the barren one. The words hit exactly where she intended them to. She knew Marcus and I had struggled. She knew the quiet pain we carried, but she weaponized it without a second thought. She told me that since I could not give Marcus a child, God had clearly stepped in and provided him an heir through Chloe. She actually had the nerve to call my sister's supposed betrayal a divine blessing. Then came the real motive. With my mother, it always came down to money. She stated that Marcus left his flesh and blood behind, and it was my Christian duty to step up and take responsibility. She quickly dropped the religious act and got straight to the business. She said Brad was struggling right now. His real estate company was going under, and he desperately needed business capital to stay afloat. She commanded me to sell my house, give them the equity they were asking for, and stop being so greedy with wealth I did not deserve to hoard. I stood in the harsh fluorescent lighting of that kitchen, the smell of roasted chicken and sweet cake glaze suddenly making me nauseous. The absolute sickness of her favoritism was laid bare right in front of me. Whenever Brad, the great white hope of the family as Mama Yvonne treated him, failed at yet another business venture, it was somehow always my job to bail him out. I was the successful financial risk manager, the one who worked 80-hour weeks to build my career from the ground up. But to her, I was nothing more than a walking ATM. I was just a resource meant to fund her favorite daughter's lavish lifestyle and prop up her son-in-law's fake entrepreneurial image. I remembered when I paid for Chloe's extravagant wedding because Mama Yvonne begged me to save the family face. I remembered covering Brad's first defaulted business loan so they would not lose their cars. Every single time I was told it was my duty as the older sister. But demanding I sell the home I built with my dead husband to fund Brad's next failure was a line I would never cross. I did not cry. The tears I had for this family had dried up a long time ago. I looked at her carefully maintained hair, her expensive church suit that I had probably paid for indirectly through my past handouts, and I felt nothing but cold, hard resolve. I told her that she was completely out of her mind if she thought I was going to liquidate my hard-earned assets to fund Brad's gambling debts and Chloe's shopping habits. I told her that my house was mine, my money was mine, and her golden child was going to have to figure out how to survive without draining my bank accounts. Mama Yvonne stepped right up into my personal space, threatening me with the wrath of the church community. She said she would make sure everyone knew I was a bitter, jealous widow who wanted to steal from an innocent, fatherless baby. She promised to ruin my reputation among everyone we knew. She said the entire congregation would ostracize me for turning my back on my own nephew. She thought the threat of social isolation would break me because it had always worked when I was younger. She thought I still craved the approval of the community she worshipped. I looked at her with a level of pity that made her take a step back. I told her she could tell the church whatever she wanted. I told her she could stand on the pulpit on Sunday morning and shout her lies to the heavens. It would not change the fact that I was leaving and never writing them another check again. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder, feeling the weight of that fake, ridiculous will resting inside it. I kept the ultimate secret to myself for now, knowing the devastation it would cause when I finally dropped it on them. I simply told her my lawyer would be in touch, pushed past her frozen figure, and walked out of the catering kitchen, leaving her screaming my name to a closed metal door. By the time I pulled my car into the driveway of my home, my phone was vibrating so violently, it felt like a trapped hornet against the center console. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine turned off, watching the screen light up with dozens of notifications per second. The digital assault had begun before I even made it back to my neighborhood. I unlocked my phone and opened Facebook. There it was, sitting at the very top of my feed, a masterpiece of modern manipulation. Chloe had posted a carefully curated photograph of baby Leo, looking mournful and innocent in his Sunday suit. Beneath the picture was an essay-long caption that could have won an award for fiction. She painted a tragic, heartbreaking narrative of a secret burden she had carried out of loyalty to my late husband. She wrote about Marcus coming to her in his darkest moments, seeking comfort from the pressures of a demanding career and a cold marriage. She claimed Marcus had begged her to protect his only biological child, knowing that his bitter, infertile wife would never accept the boy. Chloe concluded the post by begging our church community for prayers. She claimed she and Brad were fighting a David and Goliath battle against a wealthy, greedy aunt who was trying to throw a fatherless child out into the cold streets. She conveniently left out the part where they were trying to extort me for $300,000 in home equity to pay off Brad's gambling debts. The comments section was an absolute bloodbath. Our church congregation, a tight-knit community that prided itself on respectability and moral high ground, swallowed every single word of her story without a drop of hesitation. The same women who had hugged me at Marcus's funeral just 3 months ago were now publicly tearing me to shreds. Sister Miller wrote that she was praying for God to soften my wicked heart. Deacon Thomas commented that it was a crying shame to see a woman hoard wealth while her own flesh and blood suffered. Mama Yvonne, right on cue, had shared the post to her own page with a string of praying hands and crying face emojis, cementing the narrative that I was the villain of the family. My direct messages were even worse. People I had known since childhood sent me paragraphs of unsolicited advice, telling me to do the Christian thing and honor my dead husband's final wishes. Then a text message popped up from Brad. It was completely void of the polite diplomatic tone he had tried to fake at the country club. The text read that they had already retained a lawyer. He told me I had exactly 30 days to vacate the premises and sign over the deed, or they would file an emergency injunction and drag me through the courts until I was bankrupt. He added a little taunt at the end, warning me not to fight them, because the entire city already knew the truth and I would just look like a monster. Any normal person would have broken down. Any normal person would have grabbed their phone, gone live on social media, and screamed the truth into the camera to clear their name. It takes a massive amount of restraint to sit in silence while people drag your reputation through the mud. But I am a financial risk manager. My entire career is built on assessing volatile situations, identifying liabilities, and executing strategies with zero emotional interference. A social media smear campaign was nothing more than a temporary reputational risk. Reputations can be rebuilt, but federal fraud is a permanent stain. I did not type out a furious paragraph. I did not defend myself in the comment section. I did not try to reason with the church aunties who were eager for Sunday morning gossip. I simply took screenshots. I captured every single comment, every shared post, and every threatening text message Brad sent me. I downloaded them, categorized them, and backed them up to a secure cloud drive. I was documenting their entire harassment campaign, building an ironclad file of their extortion attempts. I let them think they were winning the public opinion war, knowing perfectly well that the court of public opinion has absolutely no jurisdiction in a court of law. I turned off my phone notifications, locked the front door of my $600,000 sanctuary, and poured myself a tall glass of sparkling water. I walked through the quiet, beautifully decorated rooms of the home Marcus and I had built together. I looked at the framed photographs of us on the mantel. They thought they could use his memory to break me. They thought they could weaponize his good name to steal the assets I had worked tirelessly to secure. They were dealing with the wrong woman. The very next morning, I dressed in a razor-sharp tailored suit, grabbed my leather briefcase, and drove straight to the downtown financial district. I walked into the sleek glass-paneled offices of Sterling and Associates, one of the most ruthless estate and corporate litigation firms in the state. I did not use a cheap discount lawyer. I used the kind of attorney who billed by the minute and absolutely lived for dismantling fraudulent claims. Jacqueline Sterling sat behind her massive mahogany desk, her sharp eyes scanning the piece of paper Chloe had shoved in my face the day before. The office was dead quiet as Jacqueline scrutinized the so-called will. After a full minute, she let out a short, dry laugh and tossed the paper onto her desk like it was a piece of trash. She leaned back in her leather chair and asked me if my sister and her husband were actually serious. Jacqueline pointed out that the document was a complete disaster. It was formatted like a free online template. The legal terminology was wildly outdated and contradictory. But more importantly, She tapped her manicured fingernail against the notary stamp at the bottom of the page. She recognized the name of the notary. It was a local guy who had a reputation for cutting corners on real estate documents. I told Jacqueline about the social media posts, the harassment from the church community, and Brad's threatening text messages demanding my home equity. I explained that they were trying to use public shame to pressure me into a quick settlement outside of court. Jacqueline asked if I wanted her to send a cease and desist letter immediately to shut down the online defamation. I looked at her with a calm, calculating smile and shook my head. I told her I did not want to stop them at all. I wanted to encourage them. I wanted Brad and Chloe to feel so confident, so utterly convinced of their own brilliant scam, that they would formally submit that fake will to the probate court. I explained my strategy to Jacqueline. If we sent a cease and desist now, they might get scared and back down. They might destroy the fake will and claim it was all a misunderstanding. I did not want a misunderstanding. I wanted a documented, undeniable paper trail of them attempting to commit a felony. Jacqueline's lips curved into a wicked smile. She completely understood the assignment. Once they submitted that forged document to the court under oath, it stopped being a nasty family dispute and became a serious criminal offense. Presenting a forged will to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate equity was a one-way ticket to federal prison. We spent the next 2 hours mapping out a legal trap, so perfectly constructed that Brad and Chloe would not even realize they were caught until the steel jaws snapped shut around them. Jacqueline advised me to maintain my absolute silence. I was to ignore the church members, ignore Mama Yvonne's frantic voicemails, and ignore Brad's aggressive demands. I was to let them march proudly into their own destruction. I left the law office feeling a profound sense of clarity. The bright afternoon sun reflected off the downtown skyscrapers as I walked back to my car. My phone was still silently collecting hundreds of hateful messages from people who claimed to love God, but were so quick to crucify a widow based on a Facebook post. Let them talk. Let them pray for my wicked soul. Let Mama Yvonne soak up the sympathy of the congregation while she played the role of the torn matriarch. They were all playing checkers, moving their little pieces around a social media board, completely unaware that I had just flipped the entire chess table. The drive back home from Jacqueline Sterling's law office was supposed to be a rare moment of peace. I had a solid legal strategy and a clear path forward to crush my sister's fraudulent scheme. But peace is a luxury you cannot afford when your family views your life and your assets as their personal backup plan. As I turned onto my quiet, tree-lined street in my upscale gated community, I noticed something aggressively out of place. Brad's obnoxiously oversized leased SUV was parked horizontally across my pristine driveway, crushing the edge of my flower beds. The trunk was wide open. Several large cardboard boxes and cheap plastic bins were stacked haphazardly on my front porch. And the heavy oak front door of my home, the home Marcus and I had custom built from the ground up, was propped wide open. I parked on the street, grabbed my leather briefcase, and walked up the driveway. My pulse remained completely steady, but my mind was rapidly calculating the variables. I stepped across the threshold and into the grand foyer. What I saw in my living room was a scene of such breathtaking audacity that it almost defied logic. Chloe was standing in the middle of the room, loudly complaining about the color of my expensive drapes while unpacking a box of baby toys onto my imported rug. But the real spectacle was Brad. He was sprawled across Marcus's favorite custom leather sofa. He had a half-empty beer bottle in one hand, and his dirty, scuffed sneakers were resting squarely on top of my immaculate glass coffee table. I stood in the entryway, silently watching them invade my sanctuary. Chloe finally noticed me. She did not look guilty. She did not even look surprised. She just offered me a tight fake smile and told me she hoped I did not mind the mess, but they had decided the guest bedroom downstairs would be perfect for Leo's nursery, though they would need to repaint it immediately because the current color was too depressing. I asked them in a voice so quiet it forced them to stop rustling boxes just to hear me how exactly they got into my house. Brad took a lazy sip of his beer, not bothering to remove his feet from my table. He smirked and proudly announced that Mama Yvonne had given them her emergency spare key. He said Mama Yvonne entirely agreed that it was financially irresponsible for them to keep paying rent at their current place when they practically owned half of this house anyway. Brad sat up, slightly puffing out his chest to deliver his grand declaration. He informed me that they were officially moving in. He said they needed to be on site to personally oversee the home appraisal process. He claimed they could not trust me, not to hide valuable assets or intentionally damage the property value before the probate court forced me to sell. He actually told me right there in my own living room that I could keep the master bedroom for now, but we would need to set some ground rules about sharing the kitchen space. I was trying to establish residency. If they stayed long enough, the law might consider them tenants, forcing me into a months-long, agonizing eviction process. It was a classic squatter tactic, likely advised by whatever discount lawyer he had consulted to draft that fake will. Right at that moment, my cell phone rang. It was Mama Yvonne. I answered it and put it on speaker so Brad and Chloe could hear. My mother's voice boomed through the quiet room, dripping with that manipulative, syrupy sweetness she used to mask her unreasonable demands. She told me to be a good Christian woman and welcome my sister with open arms. She said Brad was going through a tough transition with his real estate business, and it was only right that families shared their blessings during hard times. She commanded me to make them comfortable and stop being so possessive over material things that were destined to be divided anyway. I looked at Brad's dirty shoes on my glass table. I looked at Chloe unpacking her chaotic life into my peaceful sanctuary. I did not yell. I did not argue with Mama Yvonne's twisted logic. I simply ended the call mid-sentence and slid my phone back into my pocket. I looked Brad dead in the eye and asked him to remove his feet from my furniture and pack up his boxes. He chuckled, staying exactly where he was, and told me I needed to calm down, stop acting crazy, and accept my new reality. I thought I would call the local police. He thought it would turn into a messy, loud civil dispute where the responding officers would shrug, say it was a family matter, because they had a key, and leave them there to torment me. He severely underestimated the resources and the temperament of a corporate financial risk manager. I did not dial 911. I opened my contacts and dialed the direct dispatch line to Vanguard Security Solutions, the elite private security firm I contracted to protect my corporate data assets and my personal property. I paid a massive premium monthly retainer for absolute immediate discretion and zero-tolerance enforcement. I told the dispatcher I had an unauthorized breach at my primary residence involving two hostile intruders attempting to establish squatter residency. I requested an immediate tactical extraction team along with a priority smart home technician. Brad laughed out loud. He told Chloe I was bluffing, just putting on a dramatic, pathetic show to scare them. He cracked open another beer, grabbed my television remote, and turned on a sports channel. I did not say another word. I walked into my kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and waited in absolute silence. Exactly 12 minutes later, three matte black vehicles pulled silently to a halt in front of my house. Six massive, heavily built security contractors in dark tactical uniforms stepped out and walked straight through my open front door. The lead officer, a towering man who radiated absolute authority, stepped into the center of the living room and asked me to identify the trespassers. I pointed my coffee mug at Brad and Chloe. Brad's smug grin vanished instantly. He jumped off the leather sofa, spilling his beer on the hardwood floor, and started shouting that he had a legal right to be there. He waved the shiny spare key in the air, yelling about his pending lawsuit, his lawyer, and his fake will. The lead security officer did not care about his fake will. He stepped squarely into Brad's personal space, physically backing him up against the wall. The officer stated in a voice like gravel that Brad had exactly 60 seconds to vacate the private property voluntarily before he was physically removed for trespassing and property damage. Chloe started shrieking. She grabbed her baby, screaming that I was violently assaulting a mother and child, demanding Brad do something to protect his family. Brad tried to puff his chest out, trying to look tough in front of his wife, and took an aggressive step toward the security officer. It was a massive mistake. The officer effortlessly grabbed Brad by the back of his collar and his belt, marching him straight out the front door and tossing him onto the front lawn like a discarded bag of trash. Brad hit the grass hard, shouting expletives as he scrambled to his feet. The other officers efficiently swept through my living room, grabbing every single cardboard box, suitcase, and cheap plastic bin Chloe had unpacked. They carried them out and dumped the entire pile on the grass next to Brad. Chloe ran out after them, screaming hysterically into her phone, frantically dialing Mama Yvonne. While they were screaming on my lawn, the security technician was already at work on my front door. Within 15 minutes, he had completely removed the old locking mechanism. He installed a state-of-the-art military-grade biometric smart lock that required my fingerprint to open. The spare key Mama Yvonne had so generously handed over was now a useless, obsolete piece of metal. It was completely dark outside now. The neighborhood was quiet save for Chloe's frantic sobbing and Brad's hollow echoing threats as they stood in the chilly night air surrounded by their scattered belongings. Mama Yvonne pulled up to the curb a few minutes later, her car screeching to a halt. She leaped out, charging toward my porch, screaming that I was a monster, a devil who would burn in hell for treating my own blood this way. She demanded I open the door right now and let them back in before the neighbors called the police. I stepped out onto the porch, flanked by two private security officers, whose sheer size made Mama Yvonne freeze at the bottom of the steps. The porch lights illuminated the pathetic, chaotic scene on my lawn. I looked down at them from the top of the stairs. I spoke with absolute chilling clarity. I told them that this property was a fortress, and their fake keys, fake wills, and fake entitlement held zero currency here. I informed Mama Yvonne that she was officially banned from the premises, and if she ever stepped foot on my property again or attempted to facilitate another break-in for her golden child, I would have her arrested for aiding and abetting a home invasion. Brad yelled from the wet grass that he would see me in court and take everything I owned. I smiled coldly down at him and told him I was counting on it. I turned around, walked back inside my beautiful, quiet home, and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The new biometric lock chimed loudly, sealing the house. I left them standing out in the cold, dark grass, perfectly securing my territory for the war to come. The morning after I secured my home and left my sister and her husband standing on the front lawn, I woke up early to prepare for a crucial video conference. I had a high-stakes meeting with a European hedge fund, and I needed a specific leather-bound portfolio from Marcus's former study. The house was blissfully quiet, fortified by the new biometric locks. But as I crossed the threshold into the study, my eyes caught a jarring emptiness on the custom mahogany display shelf. The motorized watch window, which held Marcus's carefully curated collection of vintage timepieces, was completely bare. My gaze immediately shifted to the adjoining climate-controlled wine cabinet. The glass doors were slightly ajar. The top shelf where Marcus kept his rarest vintage bourbons and imported wines had been entirely cleared out. I did not panic. I simply turned on my heel and walked over to my central security hub. Before upgrading my front door the previous night, I already had internal cameras monitoring the common areas of my home. I accessed the encrypted server and rewound the footage to yesterday afternoon, right before I had arrived home from the lawyer's office to find Brad lounging on my sofa. The high-definition video played back a scene of absolute treachery. Mama Yvonne was marching through my husband's study with two large canvas tote bags. She was systematically clearing out the watches and the expensive liquor, handing bottles to Chloe, while loudly declaring her twisted justifications. The audio picked up my mother stating that Marcus would definitely want his son and his hardworking brother-in-law to inherit these luxury items. She actually told Chloe that Brad needed the Rolexes to look professional for his real estate investors, and that keeping these assets locked in a widow's house was a waste of perfectly good capital. They had looted my home while preparing to squat in it. I paused the video and exported the files directly to my secure cloud drive. I did not scream or throw things. I walked back to my home office, logged into my corporate meeting, and spent the next 2 hours flawlessly dismantling a high-risk investment portfolio for my clients. I kept my breathing even and my voice perfectly professional. As a risk manager, I am trained to compartmentalize crises. The moment the video call ended, I closed my laptop, grabbed my car keys, and dialed the local police precinct. I did not call my private security firm this time. Private security is for removing trespassers. Uniformed police officers are for reporting grand larceny. I drove straight to the precinct and showed the desk sergeant the clear footage of the theft. I provided the exact monetary value of the stolen assets, which easily exceeded $40,000. In our state, taking that amount of property classified the crime as a severe felony. The police did not hesitate. Two patrol cars were immediately dispatched to escort me to Mama Yvonne's house to retrieve my stolen property. I parked my car behind the police cruisers in front of my mother's neatly manicured suburban home. It was barely noon. As I walked up the driveway, flanked by two armed officers, I could hear loud, cheerful voices coming from the open dining room window. Mama Yvonne was hosting a brunch for several senior ladies from the church choir. She was using this gathering to spin her narrative, playing the heartbroken, victimized matriarch while feeding them expensive pastries and soliciting their sympathy over my supposed cruelty from the night before. I did not bother knocking. I opened the front door and walked straight into the dining room with the police officers right behind me. The cheerful chatter died instantly. 5 prominent church ladies froze with their teacups halfway to their mouths. Mama Yvonne dropped her silver serving tongs on the floor, her face draining of all color as she stared at the badges and utility belts of the officers. But my eyes locked immediately onto Brad. He was sitting at the head of the dining table laughing just moments prior while eating a plate of eggs. Strapped securely around his wrist, gleaming in the morning light, was Marcus's vintage platinum Daytona watch. Mama Yvonne started stammering, demanding to know why there were police officers disrupting her peaceful Christian home. She tried to step in front of Brad, attempting to block the officer's view of him with her body. I pointed directly at Brad's wrist and informed the officers that the suspect was currently wearing a stolen asset valued at $25,000. Brad scrambled backward, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He frantically tried to claim it was a family heirloom, a sacred gift passed down to him to honor Marcus's memory. He looked at Mama Yvonne for backup, his eyes wide with cowardice. My mother puffed out her chest, trying to summon her usual manipulative authority to save face in front of her church friends. She told the officers there was a terrible misunderstanding. She loudly declared that Marcus was a generous man who would have wanted his brother-in-law to have nice things to build his business reputation. She actually tried to convince the police that taking a dead man's property without permission was just a traditional family redistribution of wealth to support the new baby. I pulled out my tablet and hit play on the security footage. I turned the volume all the way up. The crisp audio of Mama Yvonne and Chloe plotting the theft echoed clearly through the silent dining room. The church ladies gasped in unison. One of them covered her mouth in absolute horror, staring at my mother as if she were a stranger. I looked at Mama Yvonne and stated clearly that taking $40,000 worth of assets from a grieving widow's home is not a family tradition. It is grand larceny and it is a felony. The lead officer stepped toward Brad, resting his hand firmly on his duty belt. He ordered Brad to remove the watch immediately and place it on the table. Brad's hands were shaking so violently he could barely undo the metal clasp. He slid the platinum watch across the wood surface, his face flushed with ultimate humiliation in front of the entire room. I instructed the second officer to check the hallway closet and the garage. Within 5 minutes, the officer returned carrying the 2 canvas tote bags filled with the rest of the vintage watches and the intact wine collection. They had not even bothered to hide the stolen goods properly. Mama Yvonne began to hyperventilate. She realized the church ladies were watching her every move, judging her not as a pillar of the community, but as a common thief who robbed her own daughter. The social standing she valued above all else was evaporating in front of her eyes. She reached out, trying to grab my arm, begging me in a frantic whisper not to press charges. She pleaded that an arrest would ruin the family's standing in the congregation forever. She begged me to remember that she was my mother, and that she only took the items because Brad needed to look successful, to secure a business loan to take care of Chloe. I took a deliberate step back, ensuring she could not touch me. I looked at her with absolute, unwavering coldness. I told her that she had lost the right to use the word mother the moment she decided to fund my sister's fraudulent lifestyle by desecrating my husband's memory. I turned to the officers and instructed them that I would not press formal felony charges today, simply because I had recovered my assets intact, and I refused to waste my valuable time sitting in a criminal court dealing with their pathetic drama. But I leaned in close, ensuring every single person in that dining room heard my final warning. I told Mama Yvonne that if she ever stepped foot near my property again, if she ever attempted to steal from me, or if she ever tried to use my husband's name to bail out Brad's pathetic failures, I would have her arrested, handcuffed, and dragged out of her church in the middle of a Sunday service. I picked up my bags of recovered assets, turned my back on the silent, horrified room, and walked out to my car. I drove back to work, leaving my mother's precious reputation completely shattered in the eyes of the very community she worshipped. I pulled my car into my reserved parking space at the corporate office building. The chaotic morning at my mother's house was already neatly compartmentalized in my mind. I walked through the glass lobby doors, offering polite nods to my colleagues, projecting the absolute calm of a woman who had complete control over her environment. Once inside my corner office, I locked the heavy oak door, shutting out the corporate hum of the financial district. I sat behind my polished desk, booted up my encrypted dual monitors, and took a slow, deep breath. The emotional static of dealing with Mama Yvonne was gone. It was time to get back to business. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out the folded piece of paper Chloe had shoved in my face at the country club. The fraudulent will. I smoothed it out flat on my desk under the bright, unforgiving glare of my reading lamp. As a financial risk manager, my entire career revolves around identifying discrepancies, exposing vulnerabilities, and dismantling bad investments. I decided to analyze my sister's pathetic attempt at extortion with the exact same ruthless precision I applied to corporate audits. I focused my attention on the notary stamp pressed onto the bottom right corner of the page. The ink was slightly faded, but the bold lettering was entirely legible. Gregory Dunn. I opened a secure browser and accessed a public records database, cross-referencing the name with Brad's known business associates. It took me less than 4 minutes of keystrokes to find a direct connection. Gregory Dunn was a struggling low-level real estate broker operating out of a strip mall. His professional license had been flagged twice for ethical violations regarding property disclosures. More importantly, a quick scan of his public social media profiles showed him drinking imported beers on a rented boat with Brad just 3 weeks prior. Brad had used his corrupt, desperate drinking buddy to stamp a forged legal document. It was sloppy, it was arrogant. But the true masterpiece of their stupidity was located just above that fraudulent stamp. I moved my eyes up to the date typed neatly next to my late husband's forged signature, October 15th. I stared at that date. I read it again to ensure my eyes were not deceiving me. Then, sitting in the absolute silence of my corner office, a slow, icy smile spread across my face. I actually laughed out loud. The sound bounced off the glass walls of my office. The sheer, unadulterated stupidity of my sister and her husband was staggering. It was a level of incompetence so profound that it bordered on comedic. October 15th was burned into my memory with agonizing permanent clarity. It was the absolute worst day of my entire life. On the evening of October 14th, Marcus was driving home from the hospital in pouring rain after completing a grueling 14-hour surgical shift. A reckless driver operating a commercial delivery truck ran a red light and slammed into the driver's side of Marcus's sedan at 60 miles per hour. By midnight, Marcus was out of emergency surgery. By the morning of October 15th, he was lying in the trauma wing of the intensive care unit. I closed my eyes and remembered the sterile, freezing air of that ICU room. I remembered the rhythmic, terrifying beeping of the life support monitors, keeping track of his failing heartbeat. Marcus was in a deep, medically induced coma to reduce severe brain swelling. He had a shattered collarbone, 2 punctured lungs, and a thick endotracheal tube shoved down his throat, pumping oxygen into his body. He was heavily sedated with paralytics, completely unconscious, and fighting a losing battle for his life. He remained in that exact comatose state until his organs finally failed and he passed away a week later. It was medically, physically, and legally impossible for a comatose intubated man in a secure ICU ward to sit up, review a complex property transfer document, and provide a steady, flawless signature in front of a notary public. Brad and Chloe had been so blinded by their greed, so desperate to steal my $600,000 home to pay off Brad's massive gambling debts, that they had simply picked a random date shortly before his death. They had typed up the fake will, backdated it, to make it look like Marcus had a sudden change of heart in his final days, and stamped it. They had not even bothered to align their lies with basic, verifiable medical reality. They thought they were dealing with a weak, hysterical widow who would be too blinded by the shock of an infidelity accusation to actually read the fine print. I immediately picked up my office phone and dialed Jacqueline Sterling. I did not bother with pleasantries when my ruthless estate lawyer answered the line. I instructed her to pull up the digital scan of the fake will I had sent her the previous day and look closely at the execution date. I heard the rustling of paper on her end, followed by a sharp, sudden intake of breath as her razor-sharp legal mind connected the dots. She knew the timeline of Marcus's accident. She knew he had been on life support. I told Jacqueline to subpoena the certified medical records from the hospital immediately. I wanted the attending physician's clinical notes, the intubation logs, the medication charts showing the heavy paralytics, and the restricted visitor logs from October 15th. I wanted irrefutable documented proof that Marcus was paralyzed by sedatives, while Brad and Chloe claimed he was busy signing away his assets to a secret love child. Jacqueline's voice was practically vibrating with predatory excitement. She stated that this oversight changed the entire landscape of our strategy. By involving a licensed notary public to falsify a date of signature for a man on active life support. Brad and Chloe had escalated the situation from a nasty civil property dispute to a multi-layered criminal conspiracy. Forging a signature is one crime, but conspiring with a state-appointed notary to legitimize a fraudulent document intended to extort hundreds of thousands of dollars is a severe federal offense. Jacqueline assured me she would have the certified sealed medical records hand-delivered to her office by tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my ergonomic chair. A new sickening wave of disgust washed over me, replacing the initial humor of their stupidity. While I had been sitting beside my dying husband's bed holding his freezing hand, crying until my eyes swelled shut and praying desperately for a medical miracle, my sister and her husband were already plotting to steal my home. They were calculating real estate equity while I was measuring his final breaths. They were drafting fake legal documents while I was signing consent forms for emergency surgeries. Any lingering shred of familial obligation, any tiny whisper of guilt I might have subconsciously held on to regarding my mother or my sister, completely evaporated in that moment. They were not my family. They were clinical parasites, and I was going to exterminate their influence from my life permanently. I realized I held the ultimate weapon in my hands. The medical records were the silver bullet that would instantly send Brad to prison. But my analytical mind saw a flaw in striking too early. If I handed this evidence over to the police right now, Brad and his corrupt notary friend would definitely get arrested. But Chloe would immediately play the victim card. She would wide her eyes, cry fake tears, and claim that her controlling white husband had manipulated her. She would swear she had no idea the date was fabricated. She would run back to Mama Yvonne and the church congregation, claiming she was just a naive, grieving mother, trying to do what was best for her son, and that big mean Maya was destroying her life. I could not allow Chloe to escape accountability. I needed to trap her completely. I needed her to double down on her lie in a public setting where she could not blame Brad, where she proudly claimed the authenticity of that document in front of credible witnesses. I needed a captive audience. I knew exactly who would provide that stage. Mama Yvonne. My mother was obsessed with preserving the family image in front of the church. After the humiliation I had dealt her at the choir brunch that morning, she would inevitably try to force a formal reconciliation. She would use the church elders or the senior pastor to pressure me into a corner, hoping religious guilt would force me to surrender the house and forgive Chloe's sins. When she set up that meeting, I would be ready. I packed the fake will back into my briefcase alongside my financial risk reports. I felt a surge of absolute untethered power. The trap was fully constructed, fortified with medical science and federal law. All I had to do was wait for my arrogant sister, her greedy husband, and my image-obsessed mother to walk blindly into the execution chamber. Exactly 3 days after I discovered the fatal flaw in their forged document, my office intercom buzzed. My executive assistant, a highly efficient woman who usually filtered out all uninvited visitors, sounded unusually hesitant. She informed me that my mother was in the lobby. Mama Yvonne had not come alone. She had brought Pastor Williams, the head of our church, along with two senior deacons. By bringing the highest spiritual authorities in our community to my corporate workplace, Mama Yvonne had effectively bypassed my security protocols. It was a classic heavy-handed manipulation tactic. She knew I would never cause a public scene by having armed security drag beloved church leaders out of a financial building. I told my assistant to escort them into the main executive conference room and offer them refreshments. I took a moment to adjust my blazer, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and walked down the hallway. When I opened the heavy glass doors of the conference room, the visual was almost cinematic in its sheer emotional manipulation. Mama Yvonne sat at the center of the large table, dabbing her dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. She wore a modest dark dress, playing the role of the grieving, desperate peacemaker. Chloe sat to her left, bouncing baby Leo on her knee, looking exhausted and victimized. Brad stood near the window wearing an ill-fitting suit, trying to project the image of a respectable, protective father figure. Pastor Williams, a kind but easily swayed man who had known me since I was in Sunday school, sat at the head of the table alongside Deacon Hayes and Elder Brooks. I smiled politely, greeting the church leaders with the utmost respect. I thanked them for taking time out of their busy schedules to visit my office. Pastor Williams cleared his throat, looking incredibly uncomfortable. He steepled his hands together and began with a long, drawn-out prayer about family unity, the power of forgiveness, and healing the deep wounds of betrayal. He did not know he was praying over a complete lie, and I almost felt sorry for him. Once the prayer concluded, Mama Yvonne launched right into her performance. Her voice trembled perfectly as she addressed the room. She claimed that this family was being torn apart by greed and sin. She looked at the pastor and spun a tragic tale about how Marcus had fallen into temptation, leaving behind an innocent child who was now suffering. She then turned her tear-filled eyes to me. She told me that God commands us to care for the widows and the fatherless. She insisted that holding on to an empty house out of spite was a sin against heaven. She begged me right there in front of the spiritual leaders of our community to do the right Christian thing and sign over the property to Chloe and Brad so they could raise Marcus's child in peace. Chloe chimed in right on cue. She squeezed out a few tears and softly told the room that she did not want to fight. She claimed she only wanted what Marcus had explicitly asked for in his final days. She looked directly at the elders and swore that Marcus had handed her that will with his own two hands, begging her to make sure I followed his instructions. She was locking herself into the lie, securing the trap around her own ankles just as I had planned. Brad saw what he thought was an opening. Assuming I was paralyzed by the overwhelming religious and social pressure, he reached into his cheap briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He slid them aggressively across the polished glass table toward me. He stated that his lawyer had drafted a simple transfer of equity agreement. All I had to do was sign on the dotted line, and the family could heal. He puffed out his chest, looking at Pastor Williams, and declared that he was just trying to do right by his wife and this poor baby. I let the documents sit on the glass table untouched. I looked at Pastor Williams, maintaining my absolutely calm, professional demeanor. I told him that I deeply respected his guidance and the time he had taken to mediate. I stated that faith is built on truth and justice, not extortion and deceit. I looked Brad dead in the eye and said with total, unwavering clarity that I would not be signing any documents today, tomorrow, or ever. I refused to surrender a single dime of my hard-earned assets. The sudden rejection hit the room like a physical shockwave. Mama Yvonne gasped loudly, clutching her chest. Chloe began to wail, rocking the baby and crying that I was a heartless monster. Pastor Williams raised his hands, trying to calm the escalating tension, urging me to search my heart and find compassion for my sister's plight. I ignored their theatrics and focused entirely on Chloe. I needed her on the record in front of these unimpeachable witnesses. I asked her in a very clear, deliberate voice to confirm her story. I asked if she was absolutely certain that Marcus had signed that specific will on October 15th. I asked if she was willing to swear before God and these church elders that Marcus was fully conscious, sitting up and handing her that document on that exact date. Chloe did not hesitate. Blinded by greed and the false security of the pastor's presence, she doubled down. She looked right at Pastor Williams and swore on a stack of Bibles that Marcus had looked her in the eyes and signed it on October 15th. That was all I needed. The trap was permanently sealed. Brad, however, did not understand the quiet legal maneuver I had just executed. All he saw was a defiant black woman refusing to hand over the money he desperately needed to pay off his loan sharks. He saw his guaranteed payday slipping away, and his fragile manufactured patience completely evaporated. Brad stood up so fast, his heavy chair crashed backward onto the floor. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of red. The polite, respectful facade melted away, revealing the aggressive, entitled thug underneath. He slammed his fist violently onto the glass table, making the coffee cups rattle. He pointed a trembling finger at my face and started screaming. He yelled that I was nothing but a greedy, arrogant wretch who thought she was better than everyone else. Pastor Williams stood up in shock, demanding that Brad lower his voice and show some respect. But Brad was entirely out of control. His financial panic had completely overridden his brain. He turned his fury on the entire room. In his blind, arrogant rage, the deeply ingrained racism he had always harbored bubbled straight up to the surface. He looked at me, then at the pastor and the deacons, and screamed that he was sick and tired of dealing with you people. He shouted that we were all just a bunch of ignorant ghetto trash pretending to be civilized in our little corporate suits. He yelled that he was not going to let some arrogant black woman steal what rightfully belonged to his family, and that he would burn my entire life to the ground if I did not sign that paper immediately. The silence that followed his outburst was absolute and deafening. Deacon Hayes, a 70-year-old veteran who had marched in the civil rights movement, slowly stood up. Elder Brooks stared at Brad with a look of profound, icy disgust. Pastor Williams looked at Mama Yvonne, his expression conveying complete and utter horror. The spiritual leaders of our community, the men Mama Yvonne had brought to manipulate me, had just witnessed her golden white son-in-law hurl vicious racist insults right to their faces. Mama Yvonne started shaking. Her carefully constructed world, her flawless reputation in the church was completely destroyed in a matter of seconds. She reached out toward Pastor Williams, desperately trying to apologize, stammering that Brad was just stressed and did not mean what he said. Pastor Williams did not even look at her. He adjusted his suit jacket, picked up his Bible, and looked at me with deep, sorrowful respect. He apologized for bringing this toxic disruption into my place of business. He stated that he had seen and heard more than enough to understand exactly what was happening in this family. I pressed the button on my intercom and calmly instructed my security desk to send up an escort. I looked at Brad, who was suddenly realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what he had just done. I slid his unsigned documents back across the glass table. I told him he had exactly 2 minutes to gather his trash and get out of my building before I had him arrested for making terroristic threats in a corporate office. As security arrived and ushered the disgraced group out of my conference room, I watched Mama Yvonne sobbing, trailing behind the church elders, begging them not to tell the congregation what had just happened. They ignored her completely. Brad marched out, his face pale with panic, dragging Chloe by the arm. I stood alone in the quiet conference room, pouring myself another cup of coffee. The public destruction of their character was complete. Now it was time to destroy their finances. I sat in the quiet aftermath of my conference room, the scent of expensive coffee mingling with the lingering tension of Brad's racist outburst. My mind, trained to detect hidden liabilities and expose corporate fraud, kept returning to one glaring detail. Brad was not just greedy. He was a man cornered by a threat far bigger than a failed real estate venture. His eyes had been wild with genuine panic. Thugs like Brad only act with that level of reckless, self-destructive desperation when they owe money to people who do not care about police or public scenes. I walked back to my desk, booted up my encrypted terminal, and bypassed the standard public records searches. I logged into an elite forensic accounting database accessible only to top-tier financial professionals. I ignored Brad's shell companies entirely. I knew they were all bankrupt, bled dry months ago to fund his flashy lifestyle. Instead, I ran a deep asset trace on the one person foolish enough to blindly fund him. The results populated on my screen in a matter of seconds, and I felt a chilling wave of validation wash over me. The pristine four-bedroom suburban home Mama Yvonne prized above all else, the house where she hosted her prestigious church choir brunches and proudly paraded her golden child Chloe, was drowning in highly toxic debt. A massive aggressive lien had been placed on the property just 6 weeks ago. The principal loan was for $400,000, but it was not held by a traditional bank or a reputable mortgage lender. The creditor was listed as Apex Capital Syndicate. I knew that name. Anyone who worked in the higher echelons of the financial sector knew exactly what Apex Capital was. They were a notoriously predatory lending syndicate, essentially a cartel of loan sharks operating under the very thin legal veil of a corporate LLC. They specifically preyed on desperate people who could not secure traditional loans, offering incredibly fast cash with astronomical suffocating interest rates and brutal immediate foreclosure clauses. Mama Yvonne had secretly mortgaged the very roof over her head. She had taken the house my late father had worked 30 grueling years to pay off, leveraged every single ounce of equity it held, and handed a mountain of cash directly to Brad. And Brad had clearly gambled it all away, or lost it in yet another fraudulent, idiotic scheme. To confirm the absolute severity of the situation, I contacted Vanguard Security Solutions once again. I instructed my lead investigator to conduct discreet, unobserved surveillance on my mother's property. I needed to know exactly how much pressure Apex Capital was applying. The report my investigator delivered later that afternoon painted a truly pathetic picture. Two unmarked, heavily tinted vehicles had been parked menacingly across the street from Mama Yvonne's house for 3 consecutive days. Large, intimidating men in cheap suits had been documented approaching her front door, pounding their fists against the wood at all hours of the day and night. The investigator captured photographs of these men pacing her driveway, smoking cigarettes on her perfectly manicured lawn and glaring at anyone who walked by. Mama Yvonne was hiding inside her personal fortress, keeping all the blinds tightly drawn, refusing to answer the door or even step outside to get her mail. The neighbors, the very people whose opinions dictated my mother's entire existence, were definitely beginning to notice. The pristine, untouchable reputation she guarded with her life was actively cracking under the heavy boots of ruthless debt collectors. She was terrified, trapped in a nightmare entirely of her own making. She was enduring this psychological torture, all because she blindly worshipped a white son-in-law who saw her as nothing more than a disposable temporary bank account. Brad had thrown her to the wolves the moment the money ran out, and now he was trying to steal my home to save his own skin, completely content to let Mama Yvonne lose everything. A weaker daughter would have felt a surge of pity. A softer woman would have picked up her phone, called her mother, and offered to pay off the massive debt to save the cherished family home. But I was not soft, and I was entirely done being the family savior. I did not feel an ounce of sympathy for a woman who was willing to let her own daughter be extorted just to protect her pride. I saw a brilliant, devastating opportunity. If Apex Capital foreclosed on the property, Mama Yvonne would be thrown out into the street by strangers. But if I controlled the debt, I controlled everything. I would hold the absolute, unquestionable power to dismantle her remaining arrogance piece by piece. I picked up my secure office phone and dialed my senior investment broker. I gave him a single explicit directive. I wanted to purchase the promissory note and the deed of trust for Mama Yvonne's property directly from Apex Capital. I told him to offer a 20% premium above the current payoff amount to ensure a completely seamless, immediate transaction. I instructed him to make the purchase through one of my anonymous corporate holding companies. Entering my name would not appear anywhere on the initial transfer paperwork. In the dark world of predatory lending, cash is absolute king. These syndicates do not care about acquiring physical property or dealing with lengthy eviction processes if they do not have to. They only care about securing a fast, massive return on their initial investment. My broker executed the aggressive negotiations within 3 hours. Apex Capital, eager to offload a defaulting asset for a massive guaranteed and immediate profit, eagerly accepted the buyout. They did not ask questions. They simply forwarded the digital contracts. The very next morning, A bonded courier arrived at my corporate office with a thick leather folder secured by a combination lock. I sat alone at my desk, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and methodically reviewed the legal documents inside. The assignment of the deed of trust was perfectly executed. The financial instruments, along with the brutal acceleration clauses and the immediate right to foreclose, had been transferred in full to my holding company. I opened my private wealth management portal and authorized the wire transfer, settling the massive transaction with a single satisfying keystroke. It was finalized. The terrifying loan sharks were paid off and formally removed from the equation. They would never knock on Mama Yvonne's door again. The dark vehicles would vanish from her street. She would peek through her drawn blinds later today, see the empty curb, and foolishly believe that God had answered her prayers or that Brad had miraculously bought them more time. She would breathe a heavy sigh of relief, completely unaware that the devil outside her door had just been replaced by the daughter she had severely underestimated. I picked up the heavy watermarked paper that proved I was now the sole undisputed creditor of my mother's home. I ran my fingers over the raised golden seal. Mama Yvonne still thought Brad could somehow fix this catastrophic mess if he could just steal my $600,000 house. She had absolutely no idea that her true master, the person holding the literal deed to her existence, was the very woman she had banished to the back tables of life. I was no longer just protecting my own territory and defending my late husband's honor. I had legally, quietly, and entirely conquered hers. I placed the deed of trust carefully into my briefcase, resting it right next to the fraudulent will Chloe had waved in my face. The arsenal for my final devastating strike was fully loaded. Every single lie they had told, every crime they had committed, and every debt they owed was now sitting neatly in my leather bag. I just needed to wait for the perfect moment to drop the guillotine. I gathered my things, locked my office, and walked out to my car, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of power. The war was already over. They just did not know they were dead yet. The silence that followed my acquisition of Mama Yvonne's debt was short-lived. Desperation breeds a very specific kind of audacity, and Brad was a man running rapidly out of time. 3 days after I locked the deed to my mother's house in my safe, an email arrived in my personal inbox. It was not a plea for peace, it was a vicious, unhinged ultimatum. Brad and Chloe had drafted a message dripping with venom. They stated that my refusal to cooperate was forcing their hand. They claimed they had drafted a comprehensive press release detailing Marcus's supposed secret double life. They threatened to send this fabricated story to every local news outlet, the medical board of the hospital where Marcus had worked, and every single member of our church congregation. They threatened to paint my brilliant, dedicated husband as the manipulative predator who preyed on his vulnerable sister-in-law and abandoned his responsibilities. They gave me exactly 24 hours to sign over the equity of my home, or they would hit send and destroy Marcus's legacy permanently. It was extortion in its purest, most vile form. They were using the pristine memory of a dead man as leverage to pay off violent loan sharks. A lesser woman would have felt a surge of panic. I felt a surge of absolute adrenaline. This was the exact aggressive overreach I had been waiting for. They were so blinded by their financial terror that they had completely abandoned strategy. It was time to give them exactly what they wanted, or rather exactly what they thought they wanted. I replied to their email with a single carefully crafted sentence. I told them to meet me in the lobby of my corporate building at noon the following day. When I walked down to the expansive glass atrium of my office building the next afternoon, Brad and Chloe were already waiting. They looked restless, pacing near the security desk. Brad wore a cheap suit that he probably thought made him look intimidating. Chloe held baby Leo tightly, wearing a dark, modest dress, still playing the role of the tragic, suffering mother. The moment they saw me approach, Brad squared his shoulders and lifted his chin. He thought he had the upper hand. I thought his little email threat had finally broken my spirit. I needed to play my part perfectly. As a risk manager, assessing psychology is just as important as assessing numbers. I knew that arrogant men like Brad only felt secure when the women around them appeared weak. I deliberately let my shoulders slump. I slowed my usually brisk, confident stride. I kept my eyes focused slightly downward, avoiding direct eye contact. When I finally reached them, I let out a long, shaky breath, projecting the image of a widow who was utterly exhausted by the relentless public scrutiny. Chloe immediately seized the opportunity to play the gracious victor. She stepped forward, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She told me she hated that it had to come to this. She said she never wanted to hurt Marcus's memory, but she had to put her son first. She reached out to touch my arm, and it took every ounce of my self-control not to slap her hand away. Instead, I simply stepped back, letting my voice waver just enough to sound completely defeated. I told them they had won. I said I could not endure another public scandal, and I could not bear the thought of Marcus's name being dragged through the local media. I told them the church gossip was already destroying my peace of mind, and I was willing to surrender to their demands, just to make the nightmare stop. Brad's face lit up with a sickening, triumphant grin. He crossed his arms and told me it was about time I started acting like a rational adult. He demanded the deed transfer documents right then and there. He said his lawyer was standing by to process the equity split and wire the funds directly into his business accounts by the end of the week. This was the moment of execution. I opened my leather briefcase, my hands acting out a perfectly choreographed tremble. I pulled out a thick, legally binding document stamped with my corporate firm's official seal. I handed it to Brad, but I kept my grip on the edge of the paper for just a second, forcing him to listen to my explanation. I told him that liquidating a $600,000 asset tied up in a widow's probate process was not something that could happen overnight. I used complex financial jargon to deliberately confuse him, stringing together terms about estate freezes, judicial holds, and capital gains liabilities. Brad nodded along rapidly, his eyes glazed over, pretending he understood the corporate terminology so he would not look stupid in front of his wife. I then explained that my high-powered legal team had drafted a much faster solution. I told him the document in his hands was a general power of attorney for property management. I lied with absolute unblinking conviction. I stated that this document granted him the full legal authority to act as the managing agent of the estate. I told him this piece of paper would allow him to walk into any major bank present the fraudulent will, alongside this management authorization, and initiate a massive equity line of credit against the house immediately. I assured him it was the fastest way to get the $300,000 in cash, without waiting for the courts to clear the property deed. Brad snatched the document out of my hand. He did not read the fine print. He did not question the liability clauses. He only saw the bold heading at the top and the blank signature line at the bottom. He saw dollar signs. He saw his escape route from the loan sharks currently terrorizing his mother-in-law's house. Chloe squealed with delight, bouncing the baby on her hip. She told Brad he was a genius for figuring out how to handle the bank. She turned to me, offering a condescending smile, and said she was glad we could finally resolve this like a real family. Brad whipped a pen out of his suit pocket and signed his name aggressively on the acceptance line. He shoved my copy back into my hands and carefully folded his copy into his breast pocket, treating it like a winning lottery ticket. He leaned in close to my face, his breath smelling of stale coffee and unearned arrogance. He told me it was a smart move learning my place. He said I was finally acting like a good sister and that he would handle the bank executives from here on out. He promised not to leak the story to the press as long as I stayed quiet and out of his way. I kept my eyes lowered. I nodded meekly, whispering that I just wanted to be left alone. Brad and Chloe turned around and marched toward the exit of the glass lobby. They were practically skipping. They were celebrating a massive, life-changing victory. They thought they had successfully extorted a corporate executive and secured hundreds of thousands of dollars in real estate equity simply by bullying a grieving widow. I stood in the center of the lobby and watched them walk through the revolving doors. The moment they were out of sight, my slumped shoulders snapped back into perfect posture. The fake trembling facade melted away, instantly replaced by a cold, razor-sharp smile. They had the piece of paper they wanted. They were going to march straight into the largest bank in the city, demanding a massive loan against a property, using a fraudulent will and a management document. They were completely blissfully unaware of the catastrophic reality I had engineered. My $600,000 home had never belonged to Marcus. His name was never on the deed. The property was owned entirely by an irrevocable independent trust fund, I had established long before I ever walked down the aisle. Marcus had zero legal ownership to leave to anyone, let alone a fake child. I turned around and walked toward the elevators, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I had just handed a desperate gambling indebted man a useless piece of paper and pointed him directly at a bank vault. The trap was locked. Now I just had to wait for the alarm to sound. I sat at my desk, watching the digital clock in the corner of my monitor tick forward. It was exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Brad was a creature of predictable, desperate greed. I knew he would not even wait a full 24 hours to cash in his imaginary lottery ticket. He would drive straight from my corporate lobby to the flagship branch of First Metropolitan Bank, downtown, the very institution that held the mortgage accounts for the high net worth residents of our gated community. What Brad did not know was that the senior branch manager, Arthur Sterling, was not just a bank employee, he was my personal wealth manager, and I had called him the moment Brad walked out of my building. Brad strutted into the polished marble lobby of First Metropolitan like he owned the entire financial district. According to the security footage Arthur later shared with me, Brad bypassed the standard teller lines entirely. He marched right up to the premium client concierge desk, slapped the forged will and my useless power of attorney onto the counter, and loudly demanded to speak with the senior branch manager to process an immediate, expedited equity line of credit for $300,000. He acted like a high-rolling real estate tycoon, snapping his fingers and telling the receptionist that time was money. Arthur Sterling is a man who deals with billionaires, corporate mergers, and international hedge funds on a daily basis. He does not tolerate loud, aggressive men in cheap suits. Arthur calmly escorted Brad into his glass-enclosed corner office, offered him a seat, and took the documents. Brad immediately launched into his rehearsed speech. He puffed out his chest, claiming he was the newly appointed managing agent for the estate of my late husband. He pointed at the fake will, stating that Marcus had left half of the $600,000 property to his secret child, and Brad was there to liquidate that equity immediately to fund his lucrative investment firm. Brad demanded the money wired into his business account by the end of the business day. Arthur did not blink. He adjusted his glasses, opened his secure banking terminal, and typed in my property address. He let Brad ramble on for 3 full minutes about his fake real estate empire and how he was stepping up to take care of his family. Then Arthur turned his monitor around to face Brad. Arthur kept his voice perfectly level, dripping with professional condescension. He informed Brad that there was a massive, insurmountable problem with his request. Arthur pointed to the screen and stated clearly that Marcus had absolutely zero ownership history on the property in question. He explained that Marcus's name was not on the mortgage, not on the deed, and not on the county tax records. Brad stopped talking. His smug, arrogant smile froze on his face. He leaned forward, blinking hard at the screen, demanding to know what Arthur was talking about. He insisted that Marcus and I had built that house together during our marriage. Arthur folded his hands on his desk and delivered the fatal blow. He explained that the property was purchased in cash and deeded exclusively to an independent, irrevocable trust fund 2 years before Marcus and I even got married. As the sole trustee and beneficiary of that trust, I was the only person on earth with legal authority over the asset. Arthur looked at the forged will sitting on his desk and informed Brad that a personal will, even a legitimate one, holds absolutely zero jurisdiction over a pre-existing corporate trust. He slid the documents back across the desk and told Brad that his paperwork was entirely worthless. The bank would not be issuing a loan for $300,000 or even 3 cents. The reality of the situation hit Brad like a runaway freight train. You could practically see his brain short-circuiting as the catastrophic truth set in. The imaginary money he had mentally spent to pay off his violent loan sharks at Apex Capital evaporated into thin air. He had no equity. He had no leverage. He was just a broke, desperate man holding a fake piece of paper, and the people he owed money to were currently circling his mother-in-law's house waiting for their payment. Panic is a dangerous thing when mixed with bruised male ego. Brad refused to accept defeat. He stood up, his face turning a deep, violent shade of purple. He started shouting that Arthur was lying to him. He accused the bank of conspiring with me to hide Marcus's assets. He slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, demanding that Arthur run the search again, screaming that the will proved Marcus owned half the house. Arthur stood up completely unbothered by Brad's tantrum. He pressed a discreet button under his desk, silently alerting the bank's armed security detail. Arthur firmly instructed Brad to lower his voice and exit the bank, immediately warning him that he was creating a hostile disturbance in a federal financial institution. That warning pushed Brad right over the edge of sanity. The suffocating pressure of his impending financial doom broke him completely. He grabbed the heavy brass nameplate off Arthur's desk and hurled it at the glass wall of the office, shattering it into a spider web of cracks. He swept his arm across the desk, sending Arthur's dual monitors, keyboard, and crystal paperweights crashing to the floor. He screamed a string of violent expletives, kicking a leather guest chair so hard it flipped backward into a glass display cabinet. Brad was trapped in a cage of his own making, thrashing wildly as his entire fraudulent scheme burned to the ground. But his destructive tantrum lasted exactly 45 seconds. Two massive, heavily armed bank security guards rushed through the shattered glass door. They did not ask Brad nicely to calm down. They tackled him from behind, driving him face first into the carpet. Brad thrashed and cursed, fighting against the guards, completely out of his mind with rage and terror. One of the guards easily pinned Brad's arms behind his back, driving a knee squarely between his shoulder blades to hold him down. Arthur Sterling calmly picked up his desk phone and dialed the police. Because First Metropolitan is located in the heart of the financial district, two uniformed police officers arrived within 3 minutes. I was sitting in my office when my cell phone rang. It was Arthur. He held his phone up so I could hear the beautiful chaotic symphony playing out in his branch. I listened to the heavy metallic click of police handcuffs snapping tightly around Brad's wrists. I heard the police officer loudly reading Brad his Miranda rights, informing him he was being placed under arrest for destruction of private property, disorderly conduct, and making terroristic threats in a bank. Brad was sobbing now. The tough, aggressive thug who had propped his dirty shoes on my coffee table just a few days ago was weeping like a terrified child. He was begging the police officers to let him go, screaming that his wife and baby were waiting for him, pleading that he just needed the money to pay off some dangerous people. The officers ignored his pathetic cries. They hauled him up from the floor and marched him straight through the crowded upscale bank lobby. Dozens of wealthy clients, mortgage brokers, and bank tellers watched in absolute silence as the sweating, crying man in the cheap suit was dragged out to a waiting police cruiser. Arthur brought the phone back to his ear and apologized for the brief disruption. He informed me that the trash had been successfully taken out. I thanked Arthur for his exceptional customer service and promised to send a team to cover the costs of his broken glass wall. I hung up the phone and looked out my window at the city skyline. Brad was sitting in the back of a police car facing severe criminal charges. He would not be making bail anytime soon, considering he had absolutely no money and his credit was entirely destroyed. He was locked in a jail cell, meaning he could not protect Chloe from the storm that was about to hit. He could not protect Mama Yvonne from the loan sharks. He was completely removed from the board. The arrogant man who thought he could steal my home was currently trading his cheap suit for a bright Orange County jail uniform. I had successfully amputated the muscle of their little criminal operation without ever lifting a finger. But I was not done. Brad was just collateral damage. The real mastermind behind the forged, Will, the sister who had proudly stood in front of our entire church and desecrated my husband's memory, was still sitting comfortably in Mama Yvonne's house. Chloe thought the battle was over. She thought Brad was bringing home a check for $300,000. She had no idea that I was about to drop the final, most devastating bomb right into the center of her fake, holy existence, and I was going to make sure the entire family had a front row seat to her execution. I sent a single, uncompromising text message to Mama Yvonne. I told her to bring Chloe to my house at 4 o'clock sharp if they wanted to finalize the estate settlement. I knew the promise of a massive payout would override any hesitation they had about returning to my property after the previous security incident. I also knew that their overwhelming greed would completely blind them to the obvious trap I had set. At exactly 3:55, my perimeter security cameras picked up Mama Yvonne's luxury sedan pulling into my driveway. Chloe stepped out first, clutching baby Leo tightly, looking exceptionally eager and dressed like she was preparing to attend a victory parade. Mama Yvonne walked beside her, radiating the arrogant energy of a matriarch who firmly believed she had finally broken her stubborn, ungrateful daughter. They walked through my heavy oak front doors, expecting to find me sitting at the dining table with a checkbook and a defeated expression. They expected a tearful apology. They expected complete submission. Instead, they walked into a room that looked like an active federal war room. I sat at the head of my long dining table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit projecting the absolute authority of a financial executive about to execute a hostile corporate takeover. To my immediate right sat Jacqueline Sterling, my ruthless estate attorney. Her briefcase was open, her files were perfectly organized, and her rigid posture radiated lethal legal confidence. To my left stood two plainclothes detectives from the Financial Crimes Division, their gold shields clearly visible clipped to their belts. Mama Yvonne froze dead in her tracks in the entryway. The color instantly drained from her face. Her finely tuned instincts, honed by years of manipulating church politics and neighborhood gossip, screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. She stared at the detectives, her designer handbag slipping slightly from her shoulder. Chloe, however, was far too blinded by her own greed to read the room. She marched right up to the table, bounced the baby on her hip, and demanded to know where Brad was. She complained loudly that Brad was supposed to meet them here with the bank documents and the equity check. She actually had the nerve to ask me why I was wasting time with strangers when we had a private family business transaction to finish. I offered my sister a cold, terrifying smile. I told her that Brad was currently unavailable, but we had plenty of critical business to discuss without him. I gestured for them to sit down. Mama Yvonne slowly lowered herself into a chair, her eyes darting frantically toward the front door. Chloe sat down next to her, huffing in deep annoyance, completely oblivious to the steel trap closing around her neck. Jacqueline Sterling took the floor. She did not introduce herself politely. She leaned forward, locked eyes with my sister, and placed the fraudulent will directly in the center of the glass table. Jacqueline asked Chloe to verify on the official record, and in the presence of law enforcement, that this was the exact document she claimed Marcus had given her. She asked Chloe to confirm that she was presenting this document to extract $300,000 from my estate. Chloe rolled her eyes, scoffed at Jacqueline, and proudly stated that it was not extortion. She loudly claimed it was her legal right. She tapped the paper and boldly confirmed that Marcus had looked her in the eyes and handed her that exact will to protect his son. She doubled down on her lie with breathtaking arrogance, sealing her own fate with every single word she spoke. I reached into my leather briefcase. I pulled out a thick, heavy binder sealed with the official stamp of the State Medical Board. I slammed it down onto the glass table right next to the fake will. The loud smack echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. Mama Yvonne flinched violently. I looked Chloe dead in the eyes. The polite, quiet widow was gone. The calculating risk manager took over entirely. I asked my sister to explain the miraculous medical phenomenon that occurred on October 15th. I kept my voice dangerously low, forcing her to listen to every single syllable. I described the trauma wing of the intensive care unit. I described the relentless, terrifying beeping of the life support monitors. I described the heavy endotracheal tube shoved down Marcus's throat, pumping oxygen into his crushed lungs. I painted a vivid, agonizing picture of my husband fighting a losing battle for his life. His body completely paralyzed by heavy sedatives to reduce severe brain swelling. I pointed a steady finger to the date typed on her fraudulent document. I asked Chloe how a comatose man paralyzed by heavy narcotics and actively dying on life support managed to sit up in his hospital bed. I asked her how he managed to review a complex legal property transfer, hold a pen, and sign his name flawlessly in front of a notary public. I demanded she explain this absolute medical impossibility to the two financial crimes detectives standing in my dining room. The air was instantly sucked out of the room. Chloe stopped bouncing the baby. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. You could physically see the catastrophic realization crashing through her brain as the math finally clicked into place. She stared at the date on the fake will, then stared at the thick medical binder, her eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Mama Yvonne let out a horrifying strangled gasp. She looked at the medical file, then looked at Chloe with a mixture of shock and sheer panic. Mama Yvonne was not horrified because she cared about Marcus's suffering. She was horrified because she realized her golden child had just committed a massive felony and dragged the family name directly into the crosshairs of law enforcement. Mama Yvonne started stammering frantically, trying to backtrack, claiming there must be some kind of clerical error with the dates. Jacqueline Sterling did not let them breathe. She stepped in and dropped the next bomb. Jacqueline informed them that there was no clerical error. She stated that the notary stamp belonged to Gregory Dunn. She leaned across the table and told Chloe that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had raided Gregory Dunn's strip mall office at dawn that morning. The FBI had seized his computers, his forged notary logs, and his cell phone. Jacqueline smiled sharply and revealed that Gregory had rolled on Brad the second the federal agents put him in handcuffs. He had confessed everything to save himself, providing a full documented confession that Brad had paid him to backdate a fake will to extort my property. Mama Yvonne grabbed her chest, her breathing turning rapid and shallow. She turned to the detectives, crying real tears, now begging them to understand that her family was full of good, law-abiding Christian people. She pleaded that Brad must have acted alone and that her precious daughter Chloe knew absolutely nothing about this terrible crime. Chloe's reaction was an absolute masterpiece of cowardice. The second she realized she was facing federal prison time, the facade of the loyal, devoted wife completely shattered. The self-preservation instincts of a spoiled, entitled narcissist took over instantly. Chloe shoved the fraudulent will away from her like it was on fire. She burst into hysterical, hyperventilating sobs. She pointed a shaking finger at the empty chair where Brad should have been sitting. She started screaming that Brad made her do it. She shrieked that Brad had printed the document, Brad had forged the signature, and Brad had forced her to lie to the church congregation. She sobbed violently, claiming she was a victim of domestic manipulation. She swore to the detectives that she had no idea the date was fake. She threw her husband entirely under the bus, without a single second of hesitation, perfectly willing to let him rot in a federal penitentiary if it meant she could avoid wearing handcuffs. One of the detectives finally stepped forward. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and informed Chloe that her husband was currently sitting in a holding cell downtown after violently destroying a bank manager's office earlier that afternoon. He stated that Brad was already facing multiple felony charges for the bank incident, and the federal fraud charges regarding the forged will were currently being processed by the district attorney. The detective looked down at Chloe with absolute disgust. He advised her to secure independent legal counsel immediately because her husband had already started talking to the police, and his story painted her as the primary mastermind of the entire extortion plot. Chloe let out a blood-curdling scream of pure panic. She clutched her baby, weeping uncontrollably, begging Mama Yvonne to save her. But Mama Yvonne was completely paralyzed, staring at the floor, her pristine reputation reduced to ashes. The trap had closed perfectly. The fake will was destroyed, the notary was in federal custody, the husband was in jail, and the golden sister was crying in terror as the walls of justice closed in around her. I sat quietly at the head of my table, watching the beautiful destruction of the people who had tried to ruin me, preparing to deliver the final, most devastating blow of all. The heavy silence in my dining room was suddenly broken by the sound of Chloe's frantic, ragged breathing. The walls were rapidly closing in on her. The federal fraud charges were hovering right over her head. Her husband was sitting in a jail cell, actively testifying against her, and the detectives were watching her every single move. A cornered animal will always bare its teeth in one final desperate attempt to survive. Chloe tightened her grip on baby Leo, using her own child as a physical shield against the absolute destruction of her life. She looked at me, her face smeared with mascara and tears, and she pivoted to the only defense she had left. She completely abandoned the fraudulent will. She loudly declared that the piece of paper did not matter anyway. She pointed at the baby and shrieked that regardless of any legal technicalities, Leo was still Marcus's biological son. She tried to seize the moral high ground, adopting a tone of righteous maternal indignation. She cried out that I was a heartless, bitter woman if I was willing to throw my own nephew out onto the street. She begged Mama Yvonne to intervene, screaming that blood was thicker than water and that the family had a sacred, non-negotiable duty to protect Marcus's true flesh and blood. Mama Yvonne, desperate to salvage any remaining shred of decency from this catastrophic disaster, grasped blindly at Chloe's narrative. She turned her tear-filled eyes toward me, her hands trembling. She pleaded with me to look at the child. She claimed that Leo had Marcus's eyes, Marcus's smile, and Marcus's spirit. She begged me to honor my late husband's memory by providing for his biological heir. She insisted that even if Chloe and Brad had made a terrible, illegal mistake with the paperwork, the biological truth of the child gave them a rightful claim to my resources. I sat completely still at the head of my polished dining table. I looked at my sister sweating and hyperventilating in her chair. I looked at my mother, who was still trying to use religious guilt to manipulate my finances. I looked at the two financial crimes detectives who were standing by with their notebooks open. And then I began to laugh. It was not a soft chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, resonant laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of my immaculate home. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, bitter satisfaction. The sheer absurdity of their lies was too profound to contain. My laughter was so entirely out of place in that tense, terrifying room that it made Mama Yvonne physically flinch. Chloe stopped crying, staring at me as if I had completely lost my mind. The detectives exchanged a cautious glance. Jacqueline Sterling, my brilliant attorney, simply leaned back in her chair and offered a knowing, predatory smile. I stopped laughing. My face hardened into a mask of absolute, unforgiving granite. I reached into my leather briefcase for the final time. I pulled out a second medical file. Unlike the crisp new binder containing the ICU records, this file was visibly older. The edges were worn, and the thick manila cover bore the official embossed seal of a highly prestigious oncology center in another state. I tossed the heavy file onto the glass table. It slid across the smooth surface and stopped dead right in front of Chloe's trembling hands. I kept my voice dangerously low, commanding the absolute attention of every single person in that room. I told Chloe that her entire extortion scheme, her ridiculous fake will, and her pathetic attempt to weaponize a child were built on a foundation so incredibly stupid it defied basic human biology. I instructed Chloe to open the file. She refused to touch it, her eyes wide with terror. So I delivered the truth myself, speaking the words with razor-sharp precision. I announced that at 22 years old, long before Marcus ever met me, and long before he ever became a brilliant, successful surgeon, he faced a devastating medical crisis. He was diagnosed with an aggressive form of testicular cancer. To save his life, his oncology team had to perform an immediate radical bilateral orchiectomy. That severe surgical intervention was followed by months of brutal high-dose radiation therapy. I paused, making sure the medical reality sank deep into their greedy, manipulative brains. I stated with absolute, undeniable clarity that Marcus survived the cancer, but the medical consequence was permanent. My husband was entirely, irreversibly sterile. He possessed a literal 0% chance of ever fathering a child naturally. He could not have fathered a child with Chloe. He could not have fathered a child with anyone. The air in the dining room turned to ice. Chloe's mouth opened in a silent scream of horror. The ultimate lie she had used to terrorize me, to defame my dead husband, and to extort my property was instantly vaporized by irrefutable medical science. I turned my piercing gaze directly to Mama Yvonne. My mother looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She was staring at the oncology file, her lips trembling as the catastrophic truth broke through her decades of arrogance. I decided it was time to make her feel the full weight of her past cruelty. I reminded my mother of every single Thanksgiving dinner, every Christmas morning, and every Sunday church service where she had publicly and privately humiliated me. I reminded her of the countless times she had looked down her nose at me and called me a barren, inadequate wife. I reminded her of how she constantly praised Chloe for being a fertile, perfect mother while treating my childless marriage like a shameful curse. I raised my voice, letting the fierce, protective anger I had carried for years finally spill out. I told my mother that I absorbed all of her venom, all of her vicious insults, and all of her judgmental sneers, with absolute silence. I took the blame for our empty nursery. I let the church congregation whisper behind my back. I let everyone believe that my body was the broken one. I did it to protect my husband. Marcus was an incredibly proud, brilliant, successful black man navigating a highly competitive medical field. The societal expectations of masculinity and fatherhood weighed heavily on him. The cancer had already taken so much of his youth, and the reality of his infertility haunted him deeply. We made a vow early in our marriage to keep his medical history a closely guarded secret to protect his pride and his peace of mind. I loved him so intensely that I gladly acted as his shield. I willingly wore the label of the barren wife so that the man I loved would never have to endure the pitying stares or the emasculating whispers of our invasive judgmental community. I looked Mama Yvonne dead in the eyes and told her that while she was busy tearing me down to make her golden child look better, I was demonstrating the highest form of marital loyalty. I told her she did not know the first thing about love sacrifice or family. Mama Yvonne covered her face with both hands. A loud, agonizing sob tore out of her throat. The crushing realization of her own monstrous behavior finally caught up to her. She had spent years actively torturing the daughter who was silently protecting her son-in-law. And she had spent those same years blindly worshiping the daughter who was currently sitting next to her, exposed as a sociopathic lying extortionist. I turned my attention back to Chloe. She was practically hyperventilating, holding the baby so tightly he began to squirm and fuss. Her primary weapon had just been turned into dust. She had nowhere left to run. She had no more lies to spin. I pointed a firm, manicured finger at the child sitting on her lap. I asked Chloe the final, devastating question. If my husband was completely incapable of producing a single viable medical specimen, and her legal husband Brad was currently sitting in a jail cell screaming about her infidelity, then who exactly was the father of that baby? I did not even wait for her to stammer out another pathetic excuse. I leaned across the glass table and delivered the fatal biological strike. I informed my sister, my mother, my attorney, and the two financial crimes detectives that I already knew the truth. I revealed that during the chaotic birthday party, while Chloe was busy delivering her fraudulent speech to the church congregation, I had quietly secured a discarded pacifier from the baby's stroller. I sent that sample to a private genetics laboratory, along with a DNA profile I legally obtained through a private investigator. I looked Chloe directly in the eyes and told her the results were absolute. The child she tried to pawn off as my husband's heir did not belong to Marcus. He did not belong to Brad. The baby belonged to the 24-year-old personal fitness trainer she had been sneaking away to see every Tuesday afternoon at the local gym. Chloe let out a sound that was less human and more like a dying animal. She slumped forward over the table, burying her face in her arms, wailing in total absolute defeat. Every single dirty, vile secret she had kept was now lying naked under the bright lights of my dining room. The detectives aggressively wrote down every word of my revelation, securing the final pieces of evidence required to lock her away for federal fraud. The ultimate biological shock had completely obliterated her reality, leaving her nothing but the terrifying promise of a prison cell. The two financial crimes detectives closed their notepads with a sharp, synchronized snap that echoed like a gavel dropping in a courtroom. They had everything they needed. They formally advised Chloe that the district attorney would be in touch regarding her federal indictment for conspiracy to commit fraud. They did not place her in handcuffs right there in my dining room, but the sheer suffocating promise of her impending arrest hung heavy in the air. The detectives thanked me for my profound cooperation, nodded respectfully to my attorney Jacqueline, and walked out the front door. The moment the heavy oak door clicked shut behind the detectives, the absolute reality of the devastation settled over the room. Chloe was completely paralyzed, staring blankly at the medical file that had just destroyed her entire life. She had no husband to bail her out, no fake inheritance to steal, and no church community to manipulate. She was completely, utterly isolated. But the execution was not over. Mama Yvonne, who had been sitting frozen in a state of absolute shock, suddenly snapped back to reality. The illusion of her perfect family was entirely shattered, but her deeply ingrained sense of self-preservation kicked into overdrive. She realized that Brad was sitting in a county jail cell, facing serious felony charges, which meant Brad was absolutely not bringing home a check for $300,000. The imaginary real estate equity they had planned to steal from me was gone. That realization triggered a new hyperventilating panic in my mother. She pushed her chair back, ignoring her sobbing, disgraced daughter completely. Mama Yvonne dropped heavily to her knees right there on my imported dining room rug. The proud, arrogant matriarch who had dragged me out of a country club kitchen by my arm just a few days ago was now crawling on the floor, clutching the hem of my tailored suit pants. She looked up at me, tears streaming down her face, stripping away decades of pride and religious superiority. She began to beg. She cried out that she had made a terrible mistake trusting Brad. She swore she had no idea the will was forged or that the baby belonged to a fitness trainer. She frantically tried to throw Chloe under the bus, just like Chloe had thrown Brad under the bus minutes earlier. Mama Yvonne wailed that she was just an innocent, trusting mother who had been deceived by her own wicked child. Then came the true source of her terror. She sobbed violently, clutching my legs, and confessed her darkest, most humiliating secret. She admitted that she had secretly mortgaged the family home to a ruthless syndicate of loan sharks to fund Brad's failed business. She cried that the men from Apex Capital were circling her house, pounding on her doors and threatening to throw her out into the street. She begged me, her successful, brilliant daughter, to find it in my heart to forgive her. She pleaded with me to write a check to use my massive corporate wealth to pay off the $400,000 debt and save the cherished family home from foreclosure. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me. I looked at the hands grasping my clothes, the same hands that had pointed a shaking finger in my face and called me barren. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a single drop of daughterly obligation. I smoothly stepped back, forcing her hands to fall away from my suit. I walked around the glass table and picked up my leather briefcase for the final time. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, watermarked legal folder secured with a golden corporate seal. I tossed the heavy folder onto the table right next to the medical records that had just destroyed her golden child. I kept my voice perfectly, even delivering the final catastrophic verdict with the clinical precision of a corporate executioner. I told my mother that nobody from Apex Capital was going to knock on her door ever again. I told her the dark-tinted vehicles had already stopped circling her neighborhood. Mama Yvonne let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. A desperate, delusional smile broke through her tears. She reached out toward me, thanking God for my generous heart, praising Jesus that her successful daughter had stepped in to save the family legacy. She actually believed I had paid off her debt as a gesture of unconditional love. I raised my hand, silencing her praises instantly. I looked down at her and delivered the killing blow. I informed her that the loan sharks were gone because I had bought the promissory note. I explained that I had used a blind corporate holding company to purchase the entire deed of trust at a premium markup. I pointed to the watermark folder on the table and stated with absolute terrifying clarity that I was now her sole undisputed creditor. I owned the debt. I owned the mortgage. I owned the house. Mama Yvonne stopped breathing. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers as she stared at the legal documents proving my absolute ownership of her entire existence. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or insult her. I simply laid out the cold, hard facts of her new reality. I told her that she had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset, a broken tool that was only useful when it was time to clean up her favorite children's messes. I told her she had traded her dignity, her morals, and her actual property to protect a lying daughter and a racist criminal son-in-law. I looked at my mother and my sister, two women entirely ruined by their own toxic greed. I delivered my final mandate. I informed Mama Yvonne that because the loan was already in severe default, with aggressive acceleration clauses, I was executing my legal right to immediate foreclosure. I gave her and Chloe exactly 48 hours to pack whatever cheap personal belongings they could carry and vacate my property. I told them if they were not gone by Monday morning, my private security firm would physically remove them and change the locks just like I had done to Brad. I told her she could take her impeccable church reputation and try to use it to secure a lease on a one-bedroom apartment across town. I reminded her that the church elders she had brought to my office to intimidate me had already witnessed Brad's racist explosion. The entire congregation would soon know exactly why she was suddenly homeless. There would be no sympathy casseroles from the choir ladies. There would be no prayer circles for the victimized matriarch. The social standing she valued above my happiness, above my husband's dignity, and above basic human decency was completely and permanently obliterated. Mama Yvonne let out a sound of pure, unadulterated devastation. It was a hollow, echoing wail of a woman realizing she had permanently destroyed her own life. She collapsed onto the floor, weeping uncontrollably, begging for mercy she had never once shown me. Chloe sat frozen in her chair, clutching the child that had sparked this entire fraudulent nightmare, staring blankly at the wall as her entire fake reality burned to ashes. I did not offer them a single tissue. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I turned to my attorney, Jacqueline Sterling, and thanked her for her exceptional legal counsel. Jacqueline offered a sharp, approving nod, snapped her briefcase shut, and walked out of the house, her job flawlessly executed. I turned my back on the two weeping women in my dining room. I walked slowly and deliberately out of the room, my heels clicking a steady, powerful rhythm against the hardwood floor. The war was over. I had protected my husband's legacy, defended my hard-earned empire, and completely eradicated the parasites from my life. Sometimes the most beautiful, satisfying revenge is simply letting the wicked drown in the exact same poison they tried to force you to drink. Mama Yvonne's hysterical wailing echoed through the high ceilings of my living room, her tears finally real-born from the total destruction of her social standing. She crawled closer across the hardwood, her manicured hands trembling as she reached out to grab my ankles. She wept openly, begging for mercy, invoking God, and desperately bringing up a mother's sacred love. She sobbed that she was still my mother, that blood was thicker than water, and that a mother's love should forgive all sins. I stopped at the foot of the sweeping oak staircase and turned around slowly to look down at her. My expression remained an impenetrable wall of ice. I told her that a mother's love is built on protection, honesty, and unconditional care. I looked her dead in the eyes and said that her maternal love had died the exact day she forced me to step aside, sacrifice my dignity, and surrender my happiness just to feed her pathetic vanity. Her sobbing cut off into a sharp, choked gasp. She stared up at me, realizing for the very first time that her emotional manipulation held zero power over me. Beside her on the rug, Chloe lay curled on the floor, clutching her baby, her face pale as she realized the full magnitude of her legal and financial ruin. Without another word, I turned my back on them. I placed my hand on the smooth, polished banister and began my steady ascent up the grand oak staircase. The camera glided smoothly behind me, tracking the sharp, rigid posture of my back as I walked away from the wreckage of their lives. Downstairs, the chaotic crescendo of their despair erupted once more. Mama Yvonne's desperate pleas quickly dissolved into bitter, toxic curses, while Chloe's hysterical shrieks filled the empty halls of my home. Their screaming and weeping echoed against the cold marble, a pathetic symphony of two women destroyed by their own insatiable greed. I reached the top, landing, stepped into my master suite, and reached for the heavy door. I pulled it shut. The solid oak door clicked firmly into its frame, instantly muffling their cries and locking out every single drop of trauma, deceit, and toxicity that had plagued my life for decades. I was finally surrounded by absolute golden silence. The screen slowly fades to black. Text appears on the screen. Sometimes the best revenge is to let the wicked destroy themselves with their own lies. The ultimate lesson from Maya's journey is that sharing DNA does not give anyone a free pass to exploit, manipulate, or disrespect you. True family is built on mutual care, honesty, and unconditional support, not financial extortion or conditional love. When toxic individuals, even blood relatives, try to weaponize your grief or guilt for their own selfish gains, the most powerful response is not to scream or argue. It is to quietly and meticulously protect your peace. Maya teaches us that absolute financial independence and emotional detachment are your greatest shields against manipulation. You are not obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm. Setting ironclad boundaries is an act of profound self-love. When you stop desperately seeking validation from people who are incapable of giving it, you reclaim your power. Sometimes you don't need to seek aggressive revenge. You simply need to step back, secure your assets, and let arrogant, deceitful people destroy themselves with the consequences of their own lies. You define your own worth, and walking away from a toxic environment is often the ultimate victory. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with a toxic relative to protect your own peace and future? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more empowering stories.